Before we start with the true story of Eddie Munson, stop and think about your own life and the friends you've made along the way. Did you belong to a clique? Were you an outsider? Did you have some hobbies and preferences that set you aside from the norm? What kind of clothes did you wear? Have you ever had to defend yourself, someone you know, or someone you look up to for being weird? Now, can you imagine being singled out as a murderer for any of those reasons? Both true crime and horror fans are familiar with the term satanic panic, referring to the hysteria that spread across the country in the 80s and 90s. It stemmed from the rise of heavy metal, fantasy games like Dungeons and Dragons, and dress considered goth. Young people who dyed their hair black, painted their nails black, and primarily dressed in black. They enjoyed the darker side of entertainment and openly read religious material for anything other than Christianity. They were considered devious and evil. The collective agreed that this constituted as, in a roundabout way, the likelihood of committing criminal behavior. For fans of Stranger Things, that probably rings a bell. It's a theme that's been present throughout the whole series, but we really see it come to a head in Season 4 with the enigmatic Eddie Munson. He clearly relished his position on the outskirts of popularity. As leader of the school's Dungeons and Dragons Hellfire Club, he leaned into theatrics, going out of his way to intimidate others and build his reputation as a bad boy. We first got a glimpse of a goofier, more vulnerable side of him in his interactions with popular girl Chrissy Cunningham. He clearly had a crush on her and felt out of his league, but still proved there was more to him than we realized. When Chrissy was murdered by Vecna and his supernatural breaking of bones and mutilation of bodies, Eddie very quickly became suspect number one. Initially, it was simply because she was found within his home, and he was the last one seen with her. But as more information came to light, the general public abandoned logic for torches and pitchforks. Chrissy's boyfriend, the all-American jock, Jason Carver, had a knack for firing people up with his passionate speeches at sporting events. Unfortunately, he used those powers for evil at a town hall meeting. 2 other students were murdered in the same way as Chrissy, and police didn't have a choice but to address the public. Using the adults' unfamiliarity with D&D against them, Jason managed to convince almost the entire town that the Hellfire Club was filled with Satan-worshipping, murder-protecting delinquents. Several of the townfolk spiraled into vigilante mode and began their own hunt for Eddie, which of course always goes well. No one ever stopped to question how it would be even possible for a teenager to inflict these kinds of injuries the murdered students had suffered, because they're obsessed with the idea of stopping this satanic cult that didn't even exist. As always, our young heroes knew that Eddie had nothing to do with the murders happening in town. Dustin, Max, and Lucas set about finding him, then kept him safe from the rampaging townspeople. As the storyline progressed and Eddie was drawn more into the mission, he began to drop his bad boy act and let those around him see who he truly was. He didn't lean so hard into his standoffish persona and chase everyone off, but instead embraced being part of a group who saw him for who he truly was. As endearing as he was to those of us watching, he felt like he was a coward for always running and hiding in the face of adversity, even though it had definitely saved his life. When the opportunity was presented for him to stand and fight, to give his friends a higher chance of success against Vecna, he took a stand and sacrificed himself, earning a valiant hero's death. Now we go to West Memphis, Arkansas, 1993, into the site of one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. 3 8-year-old boys went missing, which led to a tremendous community response in the search for them. Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Steve Branch had been seen riding their bikes around town around dinner time. But between 8 and 9:30 p.m. that same night, the West Memphis police received calls from the parents of each of the boys to report them as missing. No one found any trace of the missing Cub Scouts that night, but the next day was one that would live in the nightmares of everyone who witnessed the scene. One of the police officers, out searching, spotted a shoe floating in the creek located close to the town, and the next discovery was the naked body of one of the boys. The other 2 were also found nude and hogtied with shoelaces, while Christopher Byers' body showed additional signs of mutilation. Naturally, The news crushed the community while simultaneously terrifying them. It would clearly take a true monster to commit a crime like that, and as is usually the case, the rumor mill was soon running strong. Before long, the simple inhabitants of West Memphis were stoking the fires of a modern-day Salem witch trial. 3 teens were quickly identified as possible culprits due to, you guessed it, being outcasts who wore a lot of black, listened to Metallica, and were curious about the occult. As most teenagers are at some point, suddenly, there were town folks swearing that they'd seen cult gatherings in the woods where the boys had been discovered. There were mysterious nighttime orgies held by practitioners of witchcraft that had never been mentioned before. One woman, in particular, pointed the finger at a local teen, 17-year-old Jessie Miss Kelly, and that was where the waters really became muddied. For anyone who's watched the Making a Murderer series on Netflix, Jessie Miss Kelly was Brendan Dassey before Brendan Dassey was even Brendan Dassey. Jessie's low IQ and high suggestibility made him the perfect person for police to wear down and manipulate to get the answers they were looking for. They interrogated him for hours without a guardian present. A lot of the interview wasn't even recorded on audio tape, and they would get mad at him and push him for a different answer if the one he gave wasn't in line with the facts of the case. One of the most popular examples of this was that Jessie initially said in his confession that the murders had happened in the middle of the day, except during the day, the boys were still in school. After a lot of prodding, eventually interrogators steered him towards a later time that was a closer match to known events. Another was when police asked Jessie what he had used to tie up the boys. Shoelaces were found on the bodies, but Jessie guessed it was rope. Jessie eventually named 18-year-old Damien Eccles and 16-year-old Jason Baldwin as the 2 other teens involved in the murder, and the police wasted no time securing warrants to take them into custody. When asked about the discrepancies, the lead investigator claimed that Jessie had simply been confused and gotten the answers wrong. An amalgamation of wildly inaccurate witness testimonies, information not relevant to the case, and grasping at straws was presented in the trials. Jessie was tried separately, since he was the one who had quote-unquote confessed, and Damien and Jason were tried together. Damien took the brunt of the finger pointing, having been labeled the leader of the evil trio. Experts testified about how people with interest in the occult paint their nails and dye their hair black. Witnesses even claimed to have heard Damien confessing to the crime, but couldn't answer questions as to how loud his voice was, what he said before and after, and admitted they were walking pretty far away from him. A knife that had been discovered in a large pond in the general vicinity of Jason Baldwin's home was presented at the trial, even though it couldn't be linked to the teens or the murders. A manager from a fast food restaurant testified that he had called the police the same night the young boys disappeared. A man had shown up, covered in blood and mud, and locked himself in the women's bathroom. The officer who had responded to the call admitted she simply pulled into the drive-thru and neglected to go inside to try and locate the suspicious man. They did ultimately at least take swabs of the blood from the bathroom, but then during trial, claimed the evidence had been lost. And yet, the media coverage boosting the town's hysteria had done its job, even if the prosecution hadn't. Not only were the teens convicted, but Damien was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, the teens and their lawyers fought like hell with appeals, finding new evidence that hadn't been introduced at their original trials. In other words, real evidence. The attempts were repeatedly shut down, especially since most of them were brought before the original trial judge. Considering what he had allowed in the first case, it was no surprise he wasn't interested in the idea that justice may not have been truly served. In 1996, the convictions of Jessie, Damien, and Jason were all upheld in court. Lucky for them, some of the media helped expose the truth of the situation. HBO released the documentary Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, 1996, covering the original trial and following appeals, inspiring the beginning of a movement to get the West Memphis 3 out of prison. Damien's situation was especially concerning, given his place on death row. People all across the country sent postcards in support of the 3, donated time and money to their defenses, and showed up in person to support them at their hearings. In 2007, technological advances gave the three some new hope. Evidence from the scene was tested for DNA, and there was absolutely nothing linking them to the crime. While that sounds like something that would entitle them to a fresh look at the case, they still weren't granted one. Finally, in 2011, prosecutors were faced with having to potentially retry the three of them. Understandably so, the prospect terrified them, considering the weakness that had been exposed in their arguments throughout the years. In an effort to avoid another trial, Damien, Jason, and Jesse were offered a deal. They would be released from prison, effective immediately, if they entered an Alford plea. An Alford plea is often a contentious thing, sometimes sparing families from the grief of a trial, but other times viewed as an easy way out for a criminal. Most commonly, someone charged with a crime admits that the prosecution has enough evidence to potentially get a conviction without directly admitting guilt. For example, say I'm arrested for stealing candy. I have an unhealthy obsession with Sour Patch Kids, and I happen to be at the store at the time the theft occurred. If the prosecution has circumstantial evidence against me, but lack confidence in the ability to convince a jury I'm guilty, they can offer me an Alford plea, which typically carries a lighter punishment than a conviction. If I know I committed the crime and could be facing life in prison for the theft, the prosecution offering me 5 years instead would certainly be a more desirable outcome. So, I'll talk to my attorney and say, okay, I admit the evidence they have against me is decent, and they have a good case. Because I don't trust the jury to acquit me, I'm going to take that 5-year deal. I'm not saying I'm guilty, I'm saying you might be able to make it look that way, and I don't want to take the chance. On the other side of that, if I know I didn't steal the Sour Patch Kids, I can view the deal as a prosecution recognizing they won't win, and wanting me to at least serve some time. I know I'm innocent. In no way I'm okay with people thinking I did it. Take your Alford plea and take a hike. In the case of the West Memphis 3 though, it meant something a little different. They were allowed to profess their innocence and explain that they were pleading guilty simply so they would be released. It allowed them to continue trying to clear their names all free rather than trapped inside a jail cell. In 2013, another possible explanation emerged that blamed Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch, and another local man for the murders. A hair found in the midst of a crime scene potentially matched Hobbs, and certainly couldn't exclude him. A far more recent update came in November 2025, when DNA evidence was sent off again for more advanced testing. Where did this evidence come from? It's what the police had claimed was lost at the time of the original trial. The blood from the women's bathroom in the fast food restaurant wasn't so lost after all, and hopefully the world will soon have real answers about the horrific murder of those 3 boys. The parallels are easy to draw here. Horrific murders committed in a community, residents thrown into a frenzy by the idea of supernatural, devilish forces being summoned and controlled by outcasts, people who look different, like darker music and clothing, and don't fit into the established cookie cutter are the perfect suspect and can suffer the wrath of their community. While Eddie ultimately sacrificed himself for his friends, all 3 of the men convicted in West Memphis are still alive and will hopefully soon be vindicated. Horrible things happen when people let hysteria rule their actions, and there's no telling who might get caught in the crossfire. These are perfect examples of why we can't contribute to the spreading of misinformation, and have to remember that logic is truly our best friend. While we consider ourselves to be a pretty advanced species, we can do some incredibly dumb things when biases get involved.